Back on One, New York's longest-running sports call-in show, Emmanuel Berbari alongside Jackson Heil, and joined by a national baseball writer for the New York Times, Tyler Kepner. Tyler, thanks so much for taking the time today.
Sure, guys. How you doing?
Good. How are you? How's everything going during this quarantine and the absence of sports?
Yeah, it's all right. A lot of family time and a lot of time to look over some old games, classic games and everything. Try to stay busy a little bit, just following along these contentious negotiations with the owners and the players to get this game back on the field. But all in all, considering everything else that's going on everywhere, a lot to be thankful for.
Speaking of those negotiations, when the game was starting to inch closer towards coming back, was there a sense that it would get to this point where the two sides are so stubborn? Was there a sense around the game? Has it exceeded your expectations at all?
Yeah, there was. I wrote about that, fairly early on, I think, just that, hey, once we start thinking about getting this game back, money's going to be the big issue because players, even though you could call this an outlier year because it's never happened like this before, players were going to be really concerned about getting their prorated pay because that's what they agreed to in March, and they felt like that should be the end of it, the pay discussion, especially if they're taking the risk, I guess, of being out there health-wise. And owners weren't going to go for that because there won't be fans in the stands. So it was sort of bound to get ugly if there were no fans in the stands. And unfortunately, it has. You would have thought they might have, seen the bigger picture here and seen this as a much different year than anything else. But they have not been able to solve that issue.
Tyler, you've mentioned that it has gotten ugly, and it sure has. And it really doesn't seem at this point like a deal is anywhere close. And for me, at least, it's foreseeable that a stalemate can continue a lot longer. And if it does continue for, say, another month or two, do you think this is a relationship between the players' union and the owners that is salvageable at this point?
Well, they've laid out the worst case, which is that the commissioner would just impose a 48 or 50 game season on the players. He has that right as long as they've, presented them other options, and outlined all the safety protocols. He has that right to do it. So they're going to have a season. It's just, it would be a shame if it's a season where they're basically just dragging these guys back so they can just sprint to the postseason where they make so much money. They want to make a negotiated season. As far as progress, I think you can say they've made some in that they've changed their numbers and everything, but really they haven't made any fundamental progress because the owners still are still refusing to pay the full prorated salaries beyond a 50-game setup. And the players want more games, therefore make more money. And the league wants more games too, but they just don't want to pay the players the full rate. So that's where the issue is. As far as future negotiations, that's where it's going to get maybe even worse because then they're not just negotiating about 1 year. They're talking about the next collective bargaining agreement, which would cover multiple years. And that's a lot of what this is all about, is the players don't want to give ground now in their mind. They don't want to set any precedents that they feel the owners would use against them in the next CBA, and therefore, would harm them for years to come.
Speaking of not giving ground, do you foresee any scenario where the owners and players could come to an agreement that doesn't entail an 100% prorate?
No, I think the players. I would be really surprised if the players gave in on that. Now that they've seemed especially unified on that point, and nothing that I've heard internally would suggest that they're going to back off that. So, to me, the only way they can get more than a 50-game thing without, while still getting prorated pay is if the owners, because the players have to agree to expand the postseason. That's the one thing they control. So if the players agree to expand the postseason and it would put X number of dollars in the owners, X number more dollars, let's say, in the owners' pockets, then maybe the owners would say, all right, well, with that extra money, we can therefore afford 10 more games at prorated salary or whatever. Because clearly the owners have a number that, for salaries that they don't want to go over. They want to minimize their losses, they say. So if they can add more money with this extra tier of playoffs that the players want or players would agree to, then maybe they can bump up the number of games a little bit. But, time's running out because the networks don't want the programming into November. And the league says they feel like their experts have said it would be unsafe to continue in November anyway, medically. So time is just running out every day on the number of games that you can squeeze in here. So, what are we down to? The owners proposed 76, and that was like 4 days ago or something. So that, it's probably 1 for 1. So it's down to like 72. So now you're getting to within 20, 25 games. I don't know. I mean, how many more games can you get than that? 60 maybe. And then you're almost at 50. So you might just go all the way and impose it. But I think they should just figure out the most number of games that the league can absorb at full rated pay and just get it on the schedule and start promoting the hell out of it, because people don't want to listen to all this back and forth anymore. They just want a date to circle on the calendars and get excited about. They need to spin this forward into the games that we're going to have, not the games that we're going to lose.
Tyler, there's been a lot of talk, obviously, about the players' union standing pat and the owners being stubborn in their process as well. How much do you think Rob Manfred is to blame for all this? Because he's obviously kind of in a tough situation, given that he kind of has to side with the owners because they are his bosses. But at the same time, it's also his job to step in at some point. How much do you think he's to blame in all this?
Yeah, I think he hasn't quite found a way to mesh comfortably with the new union leadership. He was always pretty good at making deals. There hasn't been a work stoppage since '94. I guess you call this that, but it's not really. There hasn't been a strike lockout since '94, '95. And Rob's been a part of all those negotiations, first as a consultant, and then since 1998, he's been part of MLB officially. So he's a deal maker, and he was able to forge common ground, with Michael Weiner, who unfortunately died way too young of brain cancer, in 2014, I want to say. So maybe 13, but it was they under the new union leadership of Tony Clark. It's just been a lot harder for Rob to make those deals that he's known for. I think you could probably share the blame. I don't know if it's incumbent on the new union leadership to get along with Rob or Rob to get along with them, but the fact is that there's a lot of mistrust on both sides, and I think the players, being really competitive people, obviously they see that they've maybe given up some ground in the last couple of CBAs, and they don't want to lose again. So they're very much they seem very much united in wanting to get a deal that's a lot more favorable to them. We saw not so much this past off season, but the previous couple where the free agent market was really dry and the players got really suspicious of the owners. So there's a lot of mistrust, like I said, and suspicions among the players. And Rob has not done enough to ease their minds. I don't think he does enough, maybe reaching out to the players directly, players' side. But you're right. It's not a great relationship, and I'm sure there's blame on both sides for that.
You talked about the importance of getting a season on the books, however many games that may be. Would there be a concern about legitimacy of maybe a 50-game season that could end up hurting the sport more than helping it?
Yeah. I think that would definitely be a talking point. And again, you look back and at the legitimacy of other stuff that's happened in the past, whether it was the steroid era, changing the record books, or the Astros cheating scandal, and then winning a championship that year in 2017. And even if you really want, you can go back to all the years they played the segregated major leagues and how that should have been different than it was. So I think it's all just part of the context of baseball. You know, the split season of '81. If you really want to dig down, that the two teams are the best. The two, the division winners, basically in that year in the National League, the Reds and the Cardinals didn't even qualify for the playoffs because they didn't win either half. So, like, it's just there's been stuff like that throughout baseball history, and this will be a new one. I think people might give it a little bit of a break because everything's so weird this year. I mean, the NBA champion's going to be decided in Disney World. Hockey's doing it differently. So I think you kind of get a pass on that. You knew it was going to be a shorter season anyway. But yeah, I mean, it's going to be weird, like, that to have a flag flying forever somewhere with a 2020 on it when you really only got through maybe 50 games. Like last year, the Nationals were 19-31 after 50 games. And so were the Tigers. And so the Nationals ended up winning the World Series, and the Tigers had the first pick in the draft last night. So, what does 50 games mean? I don't know. But I do know that it's better than 0. And so if that's all we've got to go on this year, I'm sure whoever wins it isn't going to, refuse their rings. I think they'll just, happily take them and understand the context.
Tyler, taking a step back from the pandemic, you mentioned the draft going on last night, first round of the MLB draft. Kind of a weird top 10, to say the least, after Spencer Torkelson going number 1. What'd you make of the first round of last night's draft and just overall of it being only a 5-round draft as opposed to 40 rounds in the years past?
Yeah, that's the really strange part. I remember years ago, let's say 30 years ago, teams could just pick until they had no more interest in picking. I mean, they could pick 75, 80 rounds if they wanted. And then they cut it, to 50 rounds, and then I think 40 rounds, you're right. And then now it's 5, and next year it'll probably go up to 20, but that's still half of what happened before. There's a big restructuring going on at the lower levels, and that's a whole other conversation. But, the reducing minor league affiliates, trying to streamline things by having players at the complex rather than out in small towns, and, spreading the game, I think. But, the league would rather a more efficient player feeder system, and that means fewer players coming in. So I think it's a shame that it's kind of short-sighted that they only went to a 5-round draft this year. As far as the individual picks last night, I don't know enough about those guys to really say much about it, other than I'm a Vanderbilt guy, and I thought Ethan Martin might go a little before 5, but I can tell you, as great a player as he has been for Vandy, boy, the Blue Jays are going to have some really exciting young position players coming through the next few years. We've already seen Bichette and Vlad Jr. and Biggio. I don't know if Ethan Martin's father was a Major League All-Star, maybe like those guys, but he's a great young talent, and it'll be fun to see where he fits in.
Before we let you go, Tyler, looking at the Yankees and the Mets specifically, let's say there's a 50 to 70 game season this year. Who do you think it benefits more in this town, the Yankees or the Mets?
Wow. Well, I mean, the DH conceivably could benefit the Mets because it would solve their issue of where to play Cespedes if he's healthy, and how to fit him in. And you got a really nice looking lineup if you're the Mets. Now, missing Syndergaard hurts if you have a 162 game season or a 50 game season. I mean, he's not coming back. And I don't know if there's a 50 game season, I don't imagine there'll be trades, or maybe there will, but how do you even make trades? What's the deadline? Like 30 games? I don't know. So I don't know how much you can fortify that rotation to make up for that loss. So I don't know. I mean, as far as who does it benefit more, I suppose it benefits the Yankees because they had so many injuries that they would have dealt with right out of the gate in April, late March and April. Stanton and Judge and Paxton and a bunch of other guys. Obviously, Severino's not come back because he had Tommy John, but in theory, I haven't checked, but in theory, those guys will be healthy whenever the season starts up. And so a fully healthy Yankee Death Star, as they say, is pretty imposing.
That's Tyler Kepner. He's a national baseball writer for the New York Times. We appreciate you taking the time today and carving the time out of your busy schedule. Thanks.
All right, no problem, fellas. Good luck with everything.
Thanks, Tyler.